Hello, everybody. It is I, the Grouchy Historian, continuing with our video series on AP U.S. government. We are now up to Unit 5, the institutions of government. Sometimes our government seems like an institution, but we'll talk more about that later. Okay, here we go. So the American government tripod, which we've discussed in our previous videos on the Constitution and some of the other videos on American history, has the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, right? So this should be nothing new. However, as we discussed in the video on the Constitution, as laid out in the Constitution, each branch has specific delineated responsibilities, but it's a very skeletal document, I think, as we discuss. Each branch has to figure out sort of how they want to discharge those responsibilities. For example, the section of the Constitution on the U.S. Court system was not very detailed. So how our current court system has evolved has very much been an exercise between the judicial, executive, and legislative branch. Same thing with Congress and the legislative and executive branches, as we will see here now. Okay, so let's start with Congress. This is a bicameral, meaning there's two chambers, bicameral legislative body that writes the laws of the land and funds the government. Some people kind of forget, including many of our congressmen, that their number one job as congressmen and senators is to pass a federal government budget every year. I think the last time they actually passed a no-kidding budget on time was like 2006, 2005. Most of the time, they go into continuing resolutions or omnibus spending bills. We could talk about those more later, but they'd probably make your head hurt. Let's just say that for about the last 15 years, Congress has done, in the Grouchy Historian and many Americans' opinions, an extremely poor job of their number one job, which is passing appropriations and laws and passing a budget. Okay. Congress consists of 435 representatives and 100 senators. Again, as remember from the Constitution, each state has 2 senators. The 435 representatives are divvied up proportionally according to the population of each state. So each representative represents a particular district. Every 10 years, constitutionally mandated, we have a U.S. Census. We're going through one of those right now. The results of this census can have some fairly significant implications, because depending upon whether a state like California or New York loses population, they can lose congressional seats, and then states that gain population like Texas and Georgia and Florida gain seats. This, of course, means that typically about every 10 years, congressional districts within a state are redrawn according to that state legislature. This has led to what's called gerrymandering. This, again, is an extremely controversial topic that generates a great deal of noise because, of course, if your state legislature is dominated by one party or another, they will tend to draw congressional districts to benefit that party. That's politics. That's why elections are important and have consequences, in the words of one of our famous U.S. presidents. Now, this could be kind of absurd, not gonna lie. If you've ever seen a map of like the congressional districts in your home state, you may kind of wonder if it's a Rorschach ink test or if it was done by a 5-year-old, because they're not like nice little neat squares. They like go like they're ridiculous. Not gonna lie, not a huge fan of excessive gerrymandering. They should, in my humble opinion, generally follow county lines. But again, that's one of the things that state legislatures have the responsibility for. You may or may not see a sort of a question, multiple choice or whatever about what gerrymandering is, but why it's important. In recent years, there have been a number of court cases raised because one party or the other has accused the party of not only excessive gerrymandering, but of depriving certain groups of their voting rights. Typically, Democrats have accused Republicans of trying to cram all the minority voters into one particular district. Republicans have accused Democrats of drawing districts so they include more minorities. So gerrymandering is a very, very contentious topic about every 10 years. And now you see in a lot of cases where the courts have gotten involved, where they chose to exercise judicial review of how congressional districts are drawn. There are a number of important Supreme Court cases discussing elections, how long representatives can serve, and gerrymandering. Now, each chamber, as written out in the Constitution, has specific roles and responsibilities. Most importantly, and I don't think a lot of people really understand this because, of course, the way politics are done in this country is not necessarily how the Constitution was intended. Only the House of Representatives can initiate tax laws and spending bills. The Senate may only amend them. Now, each chamber typically has their own hearings on appropriations and, you know, marking up tax law and all, but according to the Constitution, only the House of Representatives can initiate the yearly budget bills for the U.S. government. Now, in addition to their legislative tasks, again, there are specific non-legislative tasks that are done by Congress. Some of these are roughly spelled out in the Constitution. Some of them have just sort of been assumed by Congress. So one of those, of course, is oversight. This is meant to be part of the checks and balances over the executive branch. So part of their budgetary authority for the various pieces and parts of the executive branch, for example, such as the Defense Department, Congress loves to haul up the Secretary of Defense, Undersecretary, Deputy Assistant Secretary, generals, admirals, all the political appointees to come and testify in front of Congress about this program, that program, and this is part of their sort of oversight of where the money is going and what the money is doing, right? There's also public education. If you've ever seen some of these public hearings where you have celebrities come in to talk about their particular pet thing, these are intended to be speeches and hearings to highlight public attention on major controversial issues. And in general, they can give ordinary citizens the ability to be heard. Again, particularly on contentious issues such as gun legislation, education legislation, immigration legislation. These are used not only for education, but let's be brutally honest, they're also used to push a particular agenda of the party in power or perhaps the party not in power. And then representatives also serve their constituents, right? Most representatives have a constituent affairs person, whatever they call this particular role. Many of them also have a office in the district where they are elected from, a sort of a constituent office. This is something that I had a personal interaction with when I was going through the process to apply to the Naval Academy. Service academies are one of those things where each congressman, each representative is allowed to nominate 10 candidates for a slot at a service academy. Now, every representative has their own process for it. When I was doing it, the congressman had a board of retired military guys that did interviews, and they looked at all your paperwork because, of course, you had a ton of paperwork to do. And they made recommendations to the representative of who he should nominate. And of course, representatives also help their constituents with veterans affairs, tax affairs, regulatory affairs. This is how they help the voters deal with the government, represent the district's needs, and help keep the voters happy before election time, right? Because all politicians want to keep getting elected to office. All right, so let's look at the sausage making. That's right. How does legislation actually get done? Or not, right? A lot of bills never even get to a vote. So let's talk about this a little. There's a very, this is a pretty detailed diagram. I put the link here You can just Google legislative process and find all kinds of flow diagrams. But some of the highlights. Okay, so number one, the legislative process is meant to be slow and deliberate. That is a feature, not a bug, right? Everybody's like, we got to do something about this right now. That's bad. That's how you have mob and emotional rule. And all you have to do is turn on the TV and you can see how well that worked out, right? It is meant to be slow and deliberate. Now, that doesn't mean it's not meant to get anything done. And there are definite timelines that Congress has sort of missed in the last 15 years. But generally speaking, it is meant to be slow and deliberate. It is meant to engender compromise. That's right, the C word is the word that nobody in this town seems to like. Compromise. You know what compromise means? That means that everybody's annoyed because they didn't get everything they wanted. That's how it works. That's how it's intended to be. Now, of course, in any budgetary process, there are a lot of committees and subcommittees. The study guide talks about those a little bit. I'm sure you're going to go into those in some detail in class. But although there is a Ways and Means and a Appropriations Committee, and there are definitely committees that are specifically charged with writing the budget. Each of these other committees, like the Armed Services Committee and other committees, are going to have a big role in that, right? Whether they have these public testimonies that we talked about on the previous slide, or maybe a certain individual sits on both committees, or some of the committee staffers, because in reality, I hate to tell you a little secret, most of the work in Congress is done by the congressional staffs. It's not really done by the congressmen or senators. That's why you have professional staffs. They don't really put that in the AP US government book here, but trust me, I've seen it, I know it. The staffs have tremendous authority and influence on how legislation gets done, right? The role of congressional leadership. This is also very important. If you've ever seen sort of the chain of command, right? You have, for example, the Speaker of the House, you have the majority whip, you have the majority leader, you have the minority leader, you have the minority whip. What's a whip? Well, okay, a whip is the person that literally whips the party into line, right? If there is a piece of legislation that the party in power is determined to get passed and wants to make sure it gets passed, the majority whip will go around and make sure that they count noses and make sure they have sufficient votes within their party to get the legislation passed. Because there's nothing more embarrassing for a Speaker of the House when their party can't muster enough votes within their own party, because they're supposed to have a majority, to pass a piece of legislation. So the role of congressional leadership can be very significant in getting a piece of extremely controversial legislation passed. If anybody's ever read the sordid tale of how Obamacare got done, yeah, this is congressional leadership and congressional maneuvering and parliamentary maneuvering and looking for the arcane rules in the congressional rule book to get things done. How does anything get done? Well, there's a lot of, I think the book might have used a more polite word. There's a lot of horse trading that gets done, right? Again, government is a very relational type of activity, right? You do this for me, I'll do this for you. You support my legislation here, I'll support your legislation there, right? In theory, major pieces of legislation typically have a Democrat and a Republican sponsor, depending on who the party is in power, right? If you look at some of the more significant pieces of legislation for about the last 50 years, they have almost all been bipartisan. And this is a good thing. This means that they have been deliberate, they have had compromise. Okay, so let's talk about the flow chart here, right? So you have a bill introduced in either the House or the Senate. It's referred to committee, right? Depending on what the bill is relating to, whether it's tax, defense, some legal matter, environmental matter, whatever. There's plenty of committees and subcommittees to hold hearings and report, right? So that's very similar. One major difference is there is a committee called the Ways and Means Committee. Okay, this is actually one of the more important roles in the House of Representatives. Who is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee? Because they control how things get done, right? There's a Rules Committee, there's a Ways and Means Committee. They determine how a bill is going to be brought up to the floor of the House, how it's going to be debated, and ultimately how it gets voted on, right? So Once they go through all the committees, get lots of public hearings, it goes to the floor vote. They debate, they add amendments. Again, this has been a very contentious issue the last few years because one party or another may want to limit the amount of debate, limit the amount of amendments that can be added, which of course makes the other party scream bloody murder that they're not getting heard, they're being rolled over, etc., which is very true in some instances, okay? So once the House passes a measure and the Senate passes a measure, there's likely to be differences. In fact, I can almost guarantee you there's going to be differences. Always. So then you have to have some sort of reconciliation, right? So there's a couple ways you can do this, right? That's shown here. One chamber can agree to the other chamber's version. Not usually going to happen. They can exchange amendments to a bill and reach agreement. That may happen. What normally happens is you have a conference committee, which basically means you take a couple of senators, you take a couple of representatives, maybe from the party in power, maybe not from the party in power, but you get enough people in a room from both the House and the Senate that they can knock heads together, figuratively speaking, and come up with a version of the legislation that is acceptable to both chambers. Now, this can be fairly straightforward if both chambers are controlled by the same party. If they are not controlled by the same party, this could probably be like a WWF cage match, because chances are one body's version is going to be significantly different than the other body's. We see this recently in all of the COVID legislation that has come forward this year, right? Because the House of Representatives was controlled by the Democrats, the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. So what you actually saw was you had a conference committee that not only had members of the House and members of the Senate, but they also had representatives from the president's administration, right? You had maybe the Secretary of the Treasury, the White House Chief of Staff coming in to help make sure that the president's interests are met, because of course the legislation must ultimately be presented to the president for signature. And if the president doesn't like it, he can either veto it, right? Or he can use a pocket veto, which they discuss here, and you should discuss the difference in the class, okay? So you have, again, this is meant to be slow, deliberate, engender compromise, negotiation, trading, all of the things to actually get legislation passed. Now, it can work incredibly fast, right? The first COVID package was probably the fastest piece of legislation that I've seen in a long time. I mean, that puppy was done in like 2 or 3 weeks. And in DC, that's like warp 9, right? Most of the time, these contentious pieces of legislation, particularly budget issues, can go back and forth a couple of 3 times before they get agreement. Yeah, it's fun. Now, let's talk about the executive branch. Now, this is an extremely busy chart, but there's a purpose for that. And this is actually off the GSA website. So what it shows here, I'll use my handy dandy arrow. You have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch, and you have the judicial branch. Now, what I really want to focus on is the executive branch, right? So the president and the vice president control, nominally, an enormous bureaucracy, right? Of advisors, cabinet secretaries, independent government agencies, et cetera, that are supposed to assist the president in his constitutionally mandated duty to execute the laws of the United States, right? So you can see these here. You have the president, the vice president, you have the executive office of the president, which has things like the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representatives. Underneath that here, you have the cabinet secretaries. Each of these control, a cabinet that has specific duties. This has grown enormously since the beginning of our country. And again, there's always the chance of duplication, overlap, and let's just call it bureaucratic infighting between different parts of the cabinet, particularly on significant issues that may involve, let's just say, going to war, where you would have the Department of Defense, the Department of State, you may have the Department of Justice, Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Treasury, Department of Homeland Security, all involved in that particular discussion. All right. Then you have the independent agencies. Now, this is what you would call the bureaucracy. I kind of remember in 1776 when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they kind of, the U.S., the colonists were not all that in favor of a huge bureaucracy. Somehow we've gotten one. And let's be brutally honest, because that's what the grouchy historian is. Some of these agencies exercise enormous authority over your life. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Reserve System, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, right? These institutions that are meant to be have a lot of congressional oversight, nonetheless operate as it says here, independent establishments. That means that for the most part, to be blunt, they kind of do whatever they want unless some congressman raises a flag. Not really exactly what our founding fathers intended, I think, but this is what it is. So as you discuss this in class, some of the issues that might come up is, what are the intended purposes of some of these organizations, particularly the Environmental Protection Agency, National Labor Relations Board, Federal Reserve System. And then, of course, the question is, who controls the bureaucracy? Always an interesting question. All right, and then, of course, there is the judicial branch. Now, this is one of the more, I think, lesser known, at least until recently, parts of the federal government, because they asserted their authority, of course, with Marbury versus Madison and McCulloch versus Maryland, but they become really almost an obsession of both political parties in the last few years, because in a lot of cases, the legislative branch of our government has ceded their role in making laws and making tough decisions and making controversial decisions. They have ceded this to the court. Now, this is my opinion, but it is backed up by a large body of other opinion makers that says because Congress doesn't want to take a stand on controversial issues like abortion, immigration rights, even some environmental issues, they basically have punted it to the federal courts. Not exactly what our framers intended, but it requires a legislative body that is willing to A, educate the public properly, and B, take a stand and then stand by their decision. All right, enough pontificating. Let's discuss the courts. So there are a number of courts with various specific authorities, such as the courts of military review, tax courts, federal claims courts, bankruptcy courts, right? These have very specific charters, very specific things to do. Then you go to the U.S. district courts. And again, these are apportioned up throughout the states, okay? And then you have 12 circuit courts of appeal that, again, are geographically based. And for example, you have like the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out in the Western U.S. You have the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Virginia and Maryland and a couple of states here. You can easily find these maps on Google if you want to. But the point is, there is a process by which court cases make their way up ultimately to the Supreme Court. Now, again, I have to keep in mind that this is the federal judiciary, right? Each state has its own court system leading up to that state Supreme Court. So, of course, one of the issues of any legal case, particularly a legal case that potentially could have national implications, is who has the authority for judicial review of that particular case, right? One side or the other will often try to figure out how to get the court out of a state court of appeals into the federal court system so that it can go up to either a district court or a U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. And then if need be, or if intended, ultimately up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, again, this has been a very contentious issue the last few years, as U.S. district court judges have often issued sweeping rulings that affect the entire nation from their district bench, which typically leads to an immediate food fight, so to speak, up the judicial court review, up to and including the US Supreme Court. Now, not going to go into a lot of detail here, but there are different methods by which the US Supreme Court can review a case. So presumably you will discuss those in class, because you can either have a case reviewed by a particular Supreme Court justice. Each of the 7 justices are sort of assigned, if you want to use that word, to a circuit court of appeal, or a couple of them, because of course there's 12 circuits and 7 justices. So you got to kind of balance that. Or 8 justices, sorry. Or is it 9? It must be 9 justices. Sorry, math is hard, people. 9 justices, 12 circuits. So you have to apportion some of those out. Okay, so, or if need be, the justices can say, we're gonna review this case in front of the entire Supreme Court, and there's a lot of legal rules, regulations, maneuvering, tradition, et cetera, on how the Supreme Court decides which case it's going to take. For the 9, forget 9 justices. Okay, so that is the institutions of government. Now, there's a lot of additional detail that was in the study guide that will be in your book. This is probably the meatiest, if that's the right word, meatiest part of the course, because here you actually get into a number of the nuts and bolts that of how the government works, okay? So diagrams are good. I highly recommend using the power of Google to find diagrams of how legislation is made, the sort of chain of command of court cases, the different bodies of the executive branch. In the particular study guide I had here, they go into detail as an example of the Department of Homeland Security and all the pieces and parts that make up that. So again, it kind of would be whatever your particular instructor wants to emphasize with you. So hopefully you've got a little peek at how the sausage is made and how our government really works. Now we're going to talk about public policy.